It's a privilege to be with you today, and I'll just start by saying titles mean nothing if you don't use that for the glory of God. And it is going to be a lesson that for any of us and any of you in medicine, you will be challenged by that. Our success often and can easily become an idol. And so you just have to be sure that, throughout your careers, in whatever you do, whether it's in medicine or other fields, healthcare, or not even outside of healthcare, that first and foremost, you maintain your first love, because there's going to be a lot of other things that are going to draw your attention. So the Shanahans, Kevin and Julianne, are philanthropists in this region, in the city. And I met them many years ago on a couple of projects. I was trying to get funded for prevention of child abuse. And one thing led to another. And they liked what they were getting and seeing, and this concept of providing for the impoverished populations. This is a wealthy family, recognizing that we don't necessarily focus on that. And this is before healthcare, health systems were even talking about health equity. So now health equity, everybody talks about it. Very few are actually doing it. You are doing it in SMI, and this is why the Shanahan Endowed Chair has allowed me to do some work specifically focusing on that space at CHOP and taking a lead in some of that work. We can talk about that maybe after the session here. So we're going to be spending our time together. It's going to go quickly. We're, sort of a 45 minutes or so to talk about suffering and the healthcare provider's response. And I want to start by saying, really, this is going to be, I'll just cut to the chase. Fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of your faith. And this is going to be the way we look at all aspects of suffering, because suffering, our understanding of suffering as believers, first and foremost, is critically important before we then talk about what that looks like and how that can be brought to bear in our vocation or our career. So I want to just throw out a question. Why does God allow suffering? I want to ask you what your thoughts are about suffering and what that means for us and for what God has allowed to happen. Don't be shy. Yes.
One part I helps us understand a little bit more like Jesus, because Jesus was on the suffering and he suffered the most spot of the other stuff. Thinking about this, so I lost something, so I'll get a little bit more part of my point of view.
Yeah, great. Yes.
And helps other things.
Yeah.
Is another aspect of that we may not have otherwise. He did the love.
And even suffering that we see of others, but also suffering that we experience, right? Great. What else? What's our first response in terms of, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, I think, if we had no suffering together, why would we feel the need to, follow God in the first place? If I was, in a place where I had no suffering, why would I need, anyone to hope for, to, follow us?
Yeah, great.
I would to bounce off that. In a way, in an interesting way, it shows us his character in that he's the only one who can either minister to it or fix it, really. And so it drives us to seek.
Yep. Excellent. I ask this question because it's a question that we will ponder in our lifetime. And I'm going to come here and say, I don't have the answer. I don't have all the answers. God didn't consult Phil Scribano to say, hey, Phil, I've got this system of creation that I'm planning, and I'm going to let my creation do their own thing and let the consequences fall where they may. We have a mystery that relates to the why, but we can understand, and I think a lot of what you described, some of you described, we can understand what he's done for us to build us up, to help us to understand how we can better minister. If we were left to our own sin nature, we would not come to him. And so there's a lot of those kinds of things that we can think about. But I want us to spend the time today. I am an elder, so it's hard to take that hat off. I will do my best to give you, and I just highlighted some of the key scriptures we'll look at this afternoon. But I want to talk a bit about that framework, because if you don't have a strong, solid, where the rubber meets the road understanding of who God is and why this question of suffering exists, there is an inability for us to fully minister. I don't know that we're going to be doing all that we could for those that are coming to us to alleviate some of that suffering. So with that, let's just talk briefly about the culture of suffering. And today, in our world and in who we are, we've got an internal drive to really understand this. There's something about this topic that is not just a curiosity. It's probably how we're wired, how God designed us for us to really make sense of some of this as we talk about this. In our culture, we have a pursuit of pleasure. We have a pursuit of personal freedom. This is antithetical to suffering. And sometimes suffering then becomes quite or even more traumatic for us because we have this sort of worldview of we shouldn't suffer, which is, so any human walking the face of the earth will see, the first moment you're born, there is some degree of suffering. We see babies cry, and that could be a form of suffering in the sense of something not right. Other cultures put the highest purpose of life something besides individual happiness. And so we are at I'll say, counterculture in life as Christians when we're dealing with this topic of suffering. If you look at alleviation of pain, it's good. It's important to alleviate pain, but at what cost? And if that becomes our new idol, then we've lost sight of the reason for that pain to seek medical attention. As one example, Paul Brand, many, many years ago, wrote a book in his travels as a missionary with managing lepers. He was a surgeon, and his understanding, if you didn't have pain, you didn't understand the harms you were causing to your limbs by not having that. So just as an example of that. Our secular view, we're never seen as a meaningful part of life. Suffering is never seen as a meaningful part of life, but only as an interruption, where our goal is to either manage or lessen the pain or look for the cause of the pain to eliminate it. And I want to stop here and say, what I'm not suggesting is that we don't utilize medicine and we don't utilize all of the blessings of the technologies that God has given us to alleviate suffering. I'm not suggesting that we don't that we avoid that or that we don't try to change public policy that might prevent a certain aspect of darkness in this world from happening again. All of that is important. God has put us on this earth to be his ambassador, to be the vessel of his grace. And so we are to pursue that, but we've got to be careful of where we place that in the order and the hierarchy of things. Because while it's crucial, that we do that, it's never going to be sufficient. And all you need to do is look at the world, look at all the bad things that have happened. Look at what has happened currently, our current events in Ukraine and Israel and Gaza, just as examples. There's a lot of things that play out that cause suffering that are beyond our capacity to understand the why and or to try to intervene. Our best politics are not going to fix the Middle East crisis. They really aren't. And we have to be honest with that, because if we don't, we could become very disillusioned. We can look at the world and we can look at things and say, boy, this is not working out, and we're going to have much greater problems moving forward if we're not seeing those kinds of successes that we want. So there's a path to suffering, a Christian path to suffering. I want to spend a few moments talking about it. And I have put up some verses here. So let me do this before we get very far. If I can have somebody tell me who you are and who would like to read these passages when we come to them. So if I can get, okay, so Joseph's going to take the first one. Next one, Psalm 77. Jonathan, keep me honest when I forget who is to look back. Catherine, it's got Romans. Is it C or a K? 2 Corinthians 1. Kenya. Thank you. Caleb, got it. Yeah, that one I got. Met Caleb for lunch. Isaiah 43. Kenna? Hannah. Oh, gosh. Bill, you need your ears checked. And Philippians. Joe, yep. All right, thank you. So, can you read, Joseph, can you read the 1 Corinthians passage for us?
But someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body will they come? How foolish! What you sow does not come to life unless it dies. When you sow, you do not plant the body that will be, but just the seed, perhaps a weed or forest. But God gives it a body as He has determined. Each kind of seed He gives His own body.
Up to 38. I'm sorry, 58.
Oh, 50.
Yep.
Okay.
Did I write 38?
Yeah.
I want to buy one.
Okay.
Okay. Not all flesh is the same. People have one kind of flesh, animals have another, birds another, fish another. There are also heavenly bodies, and there are earthly bodies. But the splendor of the heavenly bodies is one kind, the splendor of the earthly bodies is another. The sun has one kind of splendor, the moon another, and the stars another. The stars differ from stars in splendor. So will it be with the resurrection of the dead? The body that is sown is perishable, and it is raised in glory. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory, it is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown in natural body, it is raised to spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. So it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam, a life-giving spirit. Spiritual did not come first, but the natural, and after that, the spiritual. The first man was the dust of the earth. The second man is of heaven. As was the earthly man, so are those who are of the earth. And as is the heavenly man, so also are those who are of heaven. And just as we have borne the image of the earthly man, so shall we bear the image of the heavenly man. I declare to you, brothers and sisters, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does perishable inherit the imperishable. Listen, I tell you the mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed. A flash, in the twinkling of an eye, the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, the death will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For that the perishable must clothe itself with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality. And the perishable has been clothed with imperishable, and the mortal with immortality. Then the saying that is written, death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. Thanks be to God, gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, dear brothers and sisters, stand firm, and nothing new to you. As always, give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that you labor in the Lord, not in vain.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Joseph had a long verse. Not all of them are long like that, so I appreciate your carrying us through that passage. So what do you take from that passage, just in terms of understanding the Christian's perspective in the path of suffering? Where does it lead to? What do you get from that passage in terms of understanding suffering and even understanding our future destiny?
There's so much hope in those verses. Like the idea that you get from it is the only thing that passes away and ends is death. And so we are destined for, I mean, it might be rough right now, but we know how it ends. And it ends with us being raised fully with Christ and being like him.
Excellent. That's exactly right. Do we live that way on our day-to-day, on the temporal?
Well, Paul is encouraging us that we should, because therefore, your brothers and sisters, for you know that always be diligent in the work of the Lord, that your work is not vain.
Yep.
So if we're not always, we should.
Yep. But there's a reason he exhorts them, right? Because if you think, it's like, well, if they were doing it, he probably wouldn't have needed to say that, right? And I think our natural tendency is not to think of what God has prepared for us. And this concept of the future bodily resurrection and the restoration of the world, it's not something that I think many Christians think about and grapple with. We might have this understanding of, yep, when I'm all done here, there'll be something later on. But this concept of restoration, this concept of the bodily resurrection, we don't understand how all that will play out, but we are given clear word. The word is crystal clear in terms of what that's going to look like. And this hopefully motivates us. This hopefully helps us to spend that tension between the transcendent and the temporal. We live in the temporal. You're going to see lots of ugly temporal life in the streets of Philadelphia, right? You're going to feel that suffering. It's going to be palpable. But how do we still become effective? Where's our hope? And if we're not grounded in our understanding of this bodily resurrection and the restoration that God, for the new earth, the new Jerusalem that he talks about in Revelation, if we're not grounded in everything that we see before us, it's like cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm just going to put on my child abuse hat for a millisecond and say, we need to reframe. We need to reframe and say, you know, in the suffering, there's beauty. There's beauty because I can see Jesus. I can see Jesus because of the promise that he's made and the call that he's made to me to minister to this person. You see how I just reframed while I'm watching somebody who's got scabs because of chronic IV drug abuse, might be having insufficient respirations. And we've had experiences in SMI where, you know, Narcan is needed. So this is the reality of our earth. But that's not where it ends, as you poignantly stated. We have that hope. So I want to start here because I think if we don't get this right, the rest of what we do is going to be limited, and we're going to struggle more so than we might otherwise if we don't have a true grounding of our understanding of this concept of the bodily resurrection, the restoration that God has given us, the fact that the divine God was no longer impersonal. So now we have Jesus in the flesh who walked on this earth and lived and suffered on our behalf. So that's a second principle besides that bodily resurrection. The third is we're given, and you see in this passage, much more latitude for consolation, for expressing sorrow and grief. God doesn't want us to be machismo, you know, I can handle anything, just throw it at me, you know. He understands. He created us, mind, body, spirit, and the tenderness and the gentleness of our emotions we need to be willing to let those emotions out, to experience the sorrow, experience the grief. He cares for us, and he gives us ways of managing that so that we're not a puddle at the end of it. We may be a puddle for a period, and that's part of that pouring out our heart. But that's not the way it ends when we have a God who cares for us and wants us to be all that we can be, in Him. And so only when our greatest love is God, when we put Him at the center, in the front and center of our lives, a love we can't even lose, even in death. And I think that's what you also alluded to in understanding. It's like death, that's the thing we give up. Look what we gain. It's that reversal that God has given us. That's power. That's something that, again, meditate on that, focus on that, because it's going to come time and time again. And I'm, 35 years or so in medicine. I still need that lesson. I still say to myself, why, God, why is this suffering occurring? Either for myself, for family members, for patients that I see. And it's a constant reminder of His care and love for us. So we're going to move now on to Psalm 77. Jonathan, you can read that for us.
I cried aloud to God, and He will hear me. In the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. When I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. You hold my eyelids open. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. I consider the days of old, the years long ago. I said, let me remember my song in the night. Let me meditate in my heart. Then my spirit made a diligent search. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has His steadfast love forever ceased? Are His promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten it to be gracious? Has He in anger shut up His compassion? Then I said, I will appeal to the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. I will ponder all your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. For God is great like our God. You are the God who works wonders. You have made known your mighty among the peoples. You with your arm redeemed your people, the children of Jacob and Joseph. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings light up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters. Yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron.
Great, thank you. So when we listen to that passage, this Psalm 77, what do you glean from that Psalm that helps you to understand what it means to lament? What does it mean to you from that Psalm? What does lament mean? Let's just start there, even before we even look at the Psalm. What does that term mean to you?
Cry out and grieve to the Lord.
Perfect. Cry out and grieve to the Lord. Excellent. Others?
Mourning.
Mourning. Yep. So there's that ongoing process. Yep. Exactly.
That it's okay to be sad, and there's reasons to be sad, but you need to take that to Him rather than wallow in it yourself.
So let's unpack Psalm 77 for a minute. So what do you see in there that were like takeaways? Something Laura had mentioned. She started to give you a little bit of a skeleton to this psalm. What are the things that we should be thinking about first?
Remembering my song, remembering what the Lord has done.
hope and comfort with her.
Yeah. So you're picking up on a key theme, remembrance, and we're going to get there in a moment. This concept of sorrow, crying out. How well do we do that? How well do you do that? Some people are, they wear their heart on their sleeves and emotions come out and it's hard for them to recover. Others, and I will say in healthcare, I've seen this more often than not, we don't allow ourselves the time it takes to go through that grief and sorrow. Often we say there's just no time. I got to go to the next patient. I have to do this or that. And we're not allowing ourselves that key piece, that first step in the lament. But let's just say we've gone through that process, then the concept of remembrance. And what are we asked to remember? Or what are we instructed to remember? Can you get into the music?
Just like remembering that God is created all the earth, like there's nothing that He can't do to like help others, I think. But also just like how He's helped you in the past as well, like how He's been faithful, even something in the past too.
Yep, perfect. So you're highlighting maybe God's sovereignty. It's like no matter what I'm dealing with or what the experience is in the suffering and the sorrow, He is all powerful. He is sovereign and He's faithful. And how do we know He's faithful? Because we have the history of His time with His people. He's shown Himself to be faithful time and time and time and time and time. And I can go on into infinity in the number of times He has been faithful to us. Again, remember I said cognitive behavioral therapy? Squirrel that one away. Reframe. Think about the faithfulness of God, and that's something that we see here in this psalm. Yes.
So verse 2 and 3, like I don't know if I'm having trouble understanding it, but it says like and I'm reading from New King James. It says like my soul refused to be comforted, and then it says like I remember God. Is that like I remember He was there, or is that the kind of remembrance He's referring to like later in the passage?
So let me look at this.
Because the way I was understanding it, like He's lamenting and He's sad about it and He can't like fix His ways, but then He remembers God in that moment. It's like, oh, I can take it to Him. Like it's that.
What do other people think? Let's take this question. It's a good question, and look at where it is in the psalm, and the way the psalmist leads us from, I'll just say, lamenting, remembering, and trusting. So this is still early, where they're in that sorrow. When we are experiencing suffering, do we have good perspective on that suffering? No, right? Often we're like, God's against, or patients will say, we might even say it ourselves, what have I done? God is punishing me. We've got this distorted theology that easily creeps in. God is not a God who punishes us. And that's something that we've got to wrestle with. He will discipline us. But this concept of punishment, and we can wallow in that in a way that is not really allowing the use of that suffering for our benefit. So this lament really guides us and forces us to trust in Him. We must engage in that dialogue. That requires prayer. That requires reading the scriptures. That requires digging in and leaning into the disciplines that we have in our faith to really commune with God and communicate that sorrow with Him. It doesn't guarantee that we will be released from that emotional struggle. So you see this, and I think that's partly what you see that he's saying, I can't trust you, God, yet. I'm not there yet. I want to be there, but I'm not. And this is, again, early on in that process of what this psalmist is describing. We, don't have a magic wand just to have that suffering disappear. When we're confronted with painful circumstances, it brings to light big and at times troubling questions. He writes, why isn't God doing more? We start to ask those questions, and those are questions God is not afraid to answer. And these are questions that many patients will say, why has God allowed cancer? Why has he allowed me to have this? I have, 3 kids that depend upon me, and now I've got an illness that I'm not going to be able to work. What am I going to do? So these are common questions. And you've got to have some honest, humble, pain-soaked questions that are really what it means to be a Christ follower. Being honest with those questions is part of being a Christ follower, if I can dare I say. So do not be ashamed. Do not feel that those are the wrong questions to have. Those are the right questions. The psalmist is giving us guidance on that. But he doesn't leave us there. We don't just wallow in all of that, because at the end of the prayer, he turns around, leading us through personal grief and difficult questions to cause us to remember. Yes, I'll remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I'll remember your wonders of old. So there comes a point where we must bring to mind that we know to be true, and that's really where he's coming from. The truth is God is faithful. He will carry us through even in this time of suffering. So we have some guidance, and it ends with what happens at the end? What is he remembering in particular?
He probably remembers the parting of the Red Sea.
Yeah.
The waters come before God and obeying his command.
Exactly. The massive, major. If you were a Jew, this would be one of those signature events in your faith that would have you always look back to remember. What's our remembrance as believers? The cross. So our crossing of the Red Sea is Jesus's hands helping us with the sin nature that we have, that we might have a hope and a redemption for eternity. So it's the cross of Christ. That's where all of our questions, where all of our discouragement, where all of our pain, our grief can be brought and be placed. Who's got Romans? Catherine, you can just read us Romans 8:31-39.
Says, what then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, then who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? Who shall bring any charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. Who is to condemn? Christ Jesus is the one who died, more than that, who was raised, who is at the right hand of God, who indeed is interceding for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or danger, or sword? As it is written, for your sake we are being killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in all of these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am sure that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, no height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. So it encapsulates Jesus. It encapsulates, I love the depths of the earth cannot separate us. As far as the east is to the west is another verse. You can not be separated from God's love. And I think these are verses that give us comfort. So what God has given us is not so much the 10-point dissertation on why he chose to let suffering be in the world. But he's given us ample, more than ample information about who he is, about his son, and through his word in ways that we can comfort those that are suffering. And this is a wonderful verse. I've used this verse for believers. And this is, when we talk about how you approach this, you've got to be mindful of where people are at. And this might not be a verse of encouragement if somebody is hostile to Jesus. But I don't know. I'm going to start by saying I don't have an answer for those people in terms of all the things that we have available to us that God has given us to comfort. You're going to be limited in what you can comfort others, but you can show the mercy and the love of Christ through compassion, through listening, through understanding and empathizing with their pain and their suffering. If they allow you to go into that place, and that's going to be, I'm guessing that's your talk this afternoon as evangelist, that those conversations then give you all of this opportunity to share the love, the beauty, the power that is in Christ in the midst of suffering. So, all right, we are needing to fly through here. I'm just going to, okay, all right. I want to spend a few minutes just talking about the reason for suffering, and it's at the heart of the Christian faith, as hopefully we've kind of wrestled with that. We've had several passages where we've hopefully had a good understanding of that reality. But our sufferings help to prepare us as much as it is to give glory to God. And so I want to unpack that. If we look at our sufferings, they prepare us for eternal glory. And our sufferings enhance our eventual joy at our future glory. If you think about it, I think this is how we started. Somebody said, if we didn't have suffering, we wouldn't really have any reliance on God. So there's something about that construct in who we are and how we are designed that has allowed for the use of suffering to bring us to a better place for that eventual joy. Our sufferings are sometimes for others' glory, and Paul talks in multiple places in Ephesians in 1 about the reason for his imprisonment. It's for his suffering is for the benefit and the glory of the church and for God. Ultimately, our sufferings are, if handled right and worthy, bring the Lord glory, and that's really the focus of that suffering. It's also a way we can show that by glorifying God to others, we bear up under the pain of even suffering that might be unjust. When onlookers know that the sufferers are Christians, it can reveal God's power. And there's a verse in 1 Peter. It says, we always carry around in our body the death of Jesus' suffering so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. That's 2 Corinthians 4:10. And then suffering glorifies God to the universe and eventually achieves a glory for us. This suffering and glory are very intimately tied. So we've got to not just look at suffering in its negative connotation, but the way that transforms into a positive in terms of glory. And this is all because of Jesus. All right. If you can you read the 2 Corinthians passage? I think that's where we're at next.
Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble, with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. For as the sufferings of Christ abound in us, so our consolation also abounds through Christ. Now if we are afflicted, it is for your consolation and salvation, which is effective for enduring the same sufferings which we also suffer. Or if we are comforted, it is for your consolation and salvation. And our hope for you is steadfast, because we know that as you are partakers of the sufferings, so also you will partake of the consolation.
Great. So what do you take from that passage in terms of how God uses our suffering? What's he doing there? Anybody?
It's like, it's something that we go through to make us more compassionate and towards like.
Yep. What else?
It teaches us how to comfort others or console others in a way, same way that God showed us, like showing his love through our ability to be compassionate.
Yep.
This reminds me of how we get promises that Jesus himself has not endured. We have not endured anything that Jesus himself has not gone through. And so, Jesus is our example of him suffering everything that we have also gone through. Like our God is empathetic, our God is compassionate, and so we can emulate him by following his example.
Exactly. And it doesn't mean that we need to be walking in the exact same steps as another. But I would venture to guess that, what are we, 15, 18 in this room? I'm not sure how many people are here. There's not a single person in this room that has not experienced suffering in some capacity that maybe even got you to your knees at some point in life. Or have experienced that vicariously through family members and watched that and were profoundly affected by that suffering. And so God uses our experiences to allow us to be effective for his kingdom work. So if you think about, he calls us, many of us in healthcare, he's brought us in different areas. I started in emergency medicine, and my reason for being a pediatric emergency medicine physician was, first and foremost, I felt like God was calling me to care for the poor. That was my calling. But I did not want to be a primary care pediatrician. I just couldn't fathom just giving shots all day. And, there was something more than that for Phil Scribano. There are others that he has endowed and blessed with that passion and call. You like how that works? So my point is, that was what he called me to. And then what did he do? I was a camp doc volunteering for an organization called Young Life. Maybe some of you have been involved, and those camps are wild adventure camps, and you need a doc on site because wacky things happen. Kids get injured, they got to go to the hospital, to the ER. And I'm sitting during my quiet time, and it was a time God was calling me out of emergency medicine that I loved into child abuse pediatrics. So he refined that calling. He sort of pivoted me. And we're looking at all of this and the suffering that I'll just say my childhood had. This was relevant. This was important. This was a factor that took God bringing me to making that my ultimate vocation. I've been doing that for 25 years now. So he uses our suffering. He redeems it. He restores us. He can use this for his glory. He can use this to help us to be able to better minister to those around us who are suffering, to bring them closer to him, to draw his people to him. So I just wanted to highlight that passage because I think it's an important one. Suffering transforms our attitude towards ourselves. It humbles us. It removes any unrealistic self-regard and pride. You know how I said it'll cut us to the knees? And we think we can do it on our own strength. And all of a sudden you realize, uh-oh, I'm dealing with things that are way over my head. it shows us the fragility that we have. We are an entirely dependent creation to our Creator. And when we ignore that, when we choose not to acknowledge that, we might incur more suffering as a result. It profoundly changes our relationship to the good things in our lives. Sometimes some things have become too important to us and bring us to an understanding of what's truly important. So sometimes people use suffering to catch our attention. Suffering can strengthen our relationship to God as nothing else can, and then suffering is almost a prerequisite if we're going to be much use to people. And this is how we started that conversation. So I want to move to, let's see, walking with God in suffering. And we might have jumped. Yeah, Caleb, we're not going to hit 2 Corinthians 4, but it's a great passage about not being crushed, not being perplexed. You'll spend some time tonight on that passage. But I want, if we can read Isaiah 43:2, Hannah, if you can read that 2 and 3, and then verse 5, because we're going to be looking at what it looks like to walk with God in suffering. And the scriptures have a lot of metaphors. God created the wilderness, He created the universe, He created beauty in nature, and so you start to see some of that play out here.
When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flames shall not consume you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. I gave Egypt as a ransom, Cush as that in exchange for you. Fear not, for I am with you. I will bring your offspring from the east, and from the west I will gather you.
Thank you. So what do you take away from that passage? We're looking at what it looks like. What are the terms God uses, or Isaiah uses in this passage that conjures up some imagery, and that imagery can be very helpful when we're thinking about how we minister to one another in suffering. Are we alone? No, it says, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you.
So He doesn't eliminate the suffering necessarily, but He's with us in it,
Exactly.
which is better. Overall. Not really.
What else?
When you walk through fire, you should not be burned. When you go through suffering, you immediately think that there's a possible outcome, but then like fire can also be like purification, like being glorified and beautiful, like pure. Like so going back to thinking about how suffering can be good, purifies us.
Yep. The concept we talk, unfortunately, all too much about burnout in healthcare. It's a big topic. So I usually say I'm just feeling toasty. I'm not burnt out. I'm just toasty. And so think about it from that standpoint. But you're right. We are not going to be totally decimated by that, and it has a way of refining us. That's made like pure gold placed in the fire. The precious commodity that gold is in a similar way how we are to the Lord. We are His precious children, and whatever we experience in life, it's in a way, as painful as it may be, we've got to trust and remember and lament. Remember Psalm 77, that process, and bring that to Him for us to really understand maybe the deeper purposes and the underlying issues that we're having to grapple with as a result of that suffering. And then remember, we're not going to go through the passage in Daniel, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the story well known since we were, yo hi if you were in Bible stories as a child. There's 4 people in that fire, remember? So again, he will never forsake us. I seem like I'm making emphatic statements on certain things. I'm doing that to be emphatic and to be intentional because of how quickly we forget immediately when we're undergoing suffering. And I'm saying we because for us to be effective in supporting and healing and doing the things that God calls us to do in alleviating some of the suffering of patients, we have to understand in a real deep way for ourselves before we can be effective for others. So, keep that in mind. And if nothing else helps and you're so toasty, not burnt out, toasty, that you can't think of anything, think about the story of childhood with Daniel and his buddies. All right, last section I want to talk about. And this gets to the disciplines that bring peace in the midst of suffering. And this is the last passage we'll talk about. Joe, you got it. Thank you. What does this conjure up for you? What are you seeing in terms of some of the disciplines when we are faced with suffering, but the ways in which we can transform that to have peace in the midst of suffering? We're not, and Laura said, it's not ridding ourselves of suffering. That's not part of the game board. We're never going to get that peace that allows us to play that game here on earth until he comes again and brings us to that full completion of the transformation, the redemption and the transformation of the new world. But what does this passage conjure up for you? What does it start by saying? Just make sure I get the right verse. Yeah. So rejoice. So what does that mean? Is that easy to do? Not at all, right? I think we need to, part of, and in healthcare, the IQ is usually significantly above the mean in this world. How much are we using this, in our expression of our faith? Some really struggle with that. I think in this passage, God is calling us, and Paul is saying, think about such things. Remember, cognitive behavioral therapy, reframe, think. It's that process.
Can I say, this is CBT, this is the biblical
It's
version.
of course.
The devil, anything that's popular in common culture always has a biblical basis for it. If there's any truth in it at all. So here you go. Go ahead.
No, that's exactly right. We have co-opted all of God's innovation, and we reframe it as something else. Meditation and all of that's going on right now in this world because we're so toxically stressed that we need to have ways of alleviating that stress. Well, my Bible's on my phone. Read the Bible and be immersing our hearts and minds and thinking about the Bible. And then, yes, absolutely, we might need a little less cognitive behavioral therapy if we have the true source of CBT at our fingertips. So it says, think about such things. Having a heart of gratitude, thanking God. Another one. So you listen to today's, again, stress management. Show gratitude. It's a very popular theme these days. It wasn't always popular, but it's always been popular because God has called us to be thankful. And look at the order by which he says it. You know, don't be anxious, but make requests to God with thanksgiving. The order is counterintuitive. Giving thanks, then making your request to God. Yes?
I think like before, God always starting your minds to like make verses, make songs that like reminded God to assume that He would be for them back, and I think that's what talks about in Isaiah that do not be afraid, I'm here for you, I will be your demon. And this is exactly the same I feel like in Philippians, like if your mind is very like illogical, like I am the one who assures you, I'm the one who gives you points. Like even though when the Jews enter to the promised land, he still opened Jordan to the new generation. So this promise that he always keeps to the first generation, now to the second, and to the onwards to all the other generations, is so faithfulness to them.
Yep, great. Exactly. Philippians 4:8, whatever is lovely, think about such things. How often do we just look at the negative? When we're suffering or when somebody is suffering, it's hard to get them out of that muck because their mindset is just looking at all the things that are wrong. I got my car stolen last week. And I'm telling you this story not for sympathy, but I had quite a pity party. And I was looking at, and I said, God, do not make me bitter. That was my prayer, that I would not be bitter by that. And he has, so far, car's found, it was stripped and kind of working through all that reality. But when I walked to work, my prayers are, I look at my neighborhood in West Philly and I said, this is beautiful, and this is beautiful, this is beautiful. That's what he's talking about, that right here. Whatever is lovely, because there's some really ugly things out there that happen, and ugly in terms of what people experience, and ugly in terms of the manifestations of our sin here on earth. Relocating our glory, this is a concept that's not in this passage specifically, but in Psalm, David finds peace in the midst of being surrounded by his enemies. And so we see this other concept of one of the disciplines that is not in this passage, but I just wanted to highlight. And God becomes our glory through a rediscovery of the gospel of free grace through the work of Christ on the cross. I may sound like a broken record, and forgive me if that's the case, but I don't think there's ever enough time, and we can't overemphasize how much this is important to focus our efforts and our eyes and our attention on the Lord, on Jesus, on his cross, if we're going to have any sense of what suffering really is to be effective for our ministry. So it's only when suffering comes that you realize who is the true God and what are the false gods in our lives. Only the true God can go with you through that furnace and out to the other side. The other gods will abandon you in the furnace. And so the secret of peace is essentially looking and focusing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. And so that's our didactic. And I wanted to try to kind of get through that. And then just say how this might get applied. I have spent many, many years in clinical practice. I have a wedding band that has been probably my signature evangelism tool because it's an unusual band. It's a cord of 3 strands. It's not easily broken. That's Ecclesiastes 3. And for a guy wearing a band that looks not like a guy's band, it often has had questions. And so it's been a way for me to at least express, hey, I'm a Jesus follower by that alone. I'm in academic medicine. Let me just backtrack. I will say, so that's one thing. I have experienced and had opportunity to pray with families with brain tumors in their children, deaths, and some of the most powerful prayers have been where a family has invited me to pray with them as the family is gathering when a child dies. And it's because of you see quickly that some of your patients really are brothers and sisters. They really do understand where their power lies. And you can go right there. And you can go right there, and boy, they don't forget that. And that's probably where a lot of our joy will come from as believers, being able to minister in that way. But I've also had opportunities to minister in public forum. Most recently, with the Israel-Gaza conflict, we had a vigil. CHOP had 500 so on this call. And it's all secular. Okay, so let's just start by saying it's a secular experience, but I can bring the Lord to that secular experience. And there's a lot of it that was going on in the chat. I am not a social media guy, okay? In fact, I've turned a lot of that off. It's just been too distracting. So I'm not into the likes and how many likes you get, but I get that that's a big deal. So I put in the chat Psalm 34:18 in the midst of this this presentation of this vigil. And it's the verse is, "The Lord is near to the broken-hearted and protects the crushed in spirit." That verse got the most likes of anything else on that distribution on that vigil. So it struck a chord to many. God's word is our comfort. God's word is what gives us strength for us in our own suffering, but also in the suffering of others. And then the last thing I'll mention, probably one of the worst experiences in my career as a child abuse pediatrician, had a 3.5-year-old who essentially experienced torture, physical torture, by virtue at the hands of a foster parent who was not the real foster parent, but a mother who was having a hard time and trusted this evil woman. And she, quote, cared for this child, causing horrific scarring and things that I don't even want to say, very disfiguring. And the child died. And it was such a traumatic case. We see a lot at CHOP. I mean, it's a big place, large catchment area. This shook the place to the ground in the ICU. And the clergy had asked if I would participate in a debrief. And we do critical debriefing all the time on a lot of different topics. So I said, sure, I'm feeling it. My emotions, I was on that sorrow side. I was not ready to, remember. I was still feeling the pain of that case. And God reminded me of Psalm 147. And I was able to share Psalm 147 in the midst of about 80 people in the room, attending physicians, residents, students, nurses, social workers, the EMS who transported the kid. We had a whole collection of police, I forgot to mention, all in this room. There wasn't a dry eye. Psalm 147. The Lord heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. And it goes on about, again, when we look at Psalm 77, the power of his word allows for us to have a platform, even in environments that are not meant for us to be preachy, but it's real, and people respond to it. Well, I got so many emails that after that thanking me for sharing that. People that I didn't, they're not Christian. I'm not talking about just my brothers and sisters who might have been in that room, but it was a powerful experience. So use the mind that God has given you, the discipline that you have in study. Put his heart put his word in your heart. And if you can't memorize, and as I've gotten older, I've lost the skill of memorizing. I've tried so hard, but have it available, and you will be amazed at what kind of comfort you can provide for the many that will come in your contact, and they'll be blessed by from you in alleviating some of their suffering because of the power of what God can do through you. And with that, I want to thank you for your time and open up to questions if you have. And perfect. All right. So thank you. Sure.
I don't really know how to pray. I don't know exactly how to phrase this, but what do we do? How do we move forward whenever we hit a point in conversation, whenever people have basically, they say, like, I am not able to trust a God. Like, you give them all this spiel, you say, I cannot trust a God for letting X after if they're going to let X happen. You can't do it. Where do we go with that?
You accept where they're at. I think it's easy, it's so easy for us to feel like God relies upon us to redeem his people. And there's this tension, right? Because if we're totally relying on God, then it's like, why should I even sweat? Like, you're going to sweat a lot this week in North Philly, going door to door in evangelism. Why should I bother if God's already got it in his hands? So there's this tension. But I think in that situation, unless the Spirit does its work, all we're doing is being the seed deliverer, but he's got to do that work first. And, if they're hostile, it's one thing. I mean, there's references of, we take up your sandals and shake off the sand and move on. So you go to the next home. But I think that we need to be mindful of how much we might overemphasize our ability versus God's ability through us. And if that's a situation, you've planted a seed, you offer opportunity for other conversation. I know that for SMI, there's churches in the area that we always have references for families in our neighborhoods. So you allow them to know that for continued conversation, that's an option to invest in. But ultimately, you're not going to be able to do a whole lot. And I'm curious.
Just bounce off one of your points. I mean, he's determined the ends, but he's also determined the means by which we're going to be getting there. So he uses our evil efforts to bring to pass. But sometimes you gotta let that lie, especially if it's defiant and angry. If it's sorrowful and lamenting, then sometimes God understands that. He watched his son suffer. He watched his son die. He allowed it. He knew the end. He knew he was going to redeem it. But that didn't make it any easier to watch and go through. So he understands probably the worst thing that can ever happen to somebody watching die.
Yes.
And be not being able to. He couldn't. It's not that he couldn't save it, but that was the means by he wasn't going to allow it to be.
Yeah, I'll just add to that the older I get, the more experiences I have, the more when someone's there, like said, that you might not, there's no words to really necessarily, but your presence. Like you represent Jesus in your presence with that person and your care for that person. And you let that be the ministry until the time when the words will be accepted. Right?
Yep.
Right? And so that is, I think, speaks volumes. Like, okay, you're rejecting everything I'm saying. I love you anyway. How can I serve you? Like, that's really
Sometimes it's a show them.
and just presence. I mean, we know Job's friends blew it in the end, but for a while they really just sat with the guy, right? Like, how long did they just sit with him?
7 days.
7 days. Didn't say a thing. Okay, right? Maybe they should have kept him. But I think that's in his suffering of where he was, like, you just gotta sit And just got along.
A few months ago, I was in Sunday worship, and part of our service, we sort of greet one another, and there was a visitor, and he was there because his wife was in the hospital at Penn, and he was looking for a church, and he kind of lands, and he had a lot he was dealing with. And his comment was, I was just so blessed by the sweet worship, and he used that word sweet. And so think about that when you are with a person and they might be suffering. There's something, the aroma of Christ. You use, again, whatever analogy that or metaphor that God has given us, hold on to that, because that is what we can emote, that is what we can present. And that might be all that we're called to do in the moment. But the heart, if the heart is made of flesh and soft to be receiving that and understanding that, they will respond. But it's all in His hands ultimately. And just to recognize that our call is to be obedient to where He's called us to do what He's called us to do, and not to worry about the rest. He's got that. Any other questions or comments? All right.
Thank you, appreciate it.
All righty. You guys have a great day.